Welcome to Understanding Islam, the Big Picture. In all the years that I've been trying to help people to understand Islam, one question that comes up every time without fail is, help us to understand the difference between the Sunni and the Shi'a. And so this is the topic that we're going to try to work on today. Now, this is one of those questions that you can't tell in such a way that pleases everybody, because you have two different stories within the two communities within Islam. If you want to go to my website, you'll find there two articles that tell those two stories in their own tradition, in their own way. What we're going to try to do today is to look at both those stories, in a sense, running side by side, so that we can keep pace with both of them as they develop. This is a question of acute sensitivity within the Muslim world today and within the Muslim communities. If you listen to the news, then the context in which we hear of Sunni-Shia difference is often one of violence and of killing. It's very important that we remember this is not the way it's always been, and this is not the way that it should be. Throughout many centuries, Sunni and Shia Muslims have lived side by side in different parts of the world, celebrating life together, working together, marrying between the two communities. This is the tradition of Islam, and not what we see at the moment. When we learn our own tradition, we always learn it from our own story, and so people tend to see it from their perspective. So as we go on through the program, Sunnis who are watching will want to say, but. And at other times, Shias who are watching will want to say, yes, but remember, and so on. It's not possible to reconcile these two traditions within Islam. At least it's not possible for a mere mortal like me and someone of limited knowledge. How can I be expected to reconcile these two traditions? That's not what I'm going to try to do. What I'm going to try to do is fairly and accurately to report both traditions so that we can understand them. And I'm going to do this in a non-judgmental way. So please don't expect me to tell you, here they're right, there they're wrong. That's not for me to say. The majority of Muslims in the world are Sunnis. But just because you are the majority doesn't mean that you're necessarily right. And the minority of Muslims in the world are Shia. But just because you're the minority, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily wrong. These questions are not judged by numbers of votes. Finally, it's important for us to remember that nobody says, the Sunnis do not say, this is the way that God intended for us Sunnis, and the Shia do not say, this is the way that God intended for us Shia. Rather, both communities are saying, this is the way that God intended Islam to be for all Muslims. So there we are. Now let's begin. It's important to begin by saying just what there is in common, and therefore where do the roots of the differences lie. First of all, we have one edition of the Qur'an. There is one common text. So nobody is saying there's something in my Qur'an that is not in your Qur'an. So differences then stemming from the Qur'an come from interpretation. One community interprets a verse this way, another a different way. Now that then raises the question, who has the right to interpret the Qur'an? And we need to keep that in mind as we go forward. Secondly, all Muslims say that they follow the sunnah or the tradition of Muhammad. Nobody would ever deny that. The word Sunni in fact means those who follow the tradition of Muhammad, but that applies to all Muslims. Of course, the reality is that there are certain elements within the customary practice of Muhammad that are seen differently between the two communities, that have been handed down and taught to their members in different ways. So the principle, everybody follows the sunnah, is there, but some elements within that sunnah are differently understood. In the same way, we have the hadith, the reported traditions of the teaching, the sayings, the doings of Prophet Muhammad. Now, all Muslims will say that they follow the hadith, the teaching of the Prophet. There are some hadith which are in common in both the Sunni and the Shi'a collections, but there are other hadith that are only there in the Sunni collections, and then there are some that are only in the Shi'a collections. And in fact, there's a different methodology within both community to examine and classify these hadith. So the principle of following the teaching of the Prophet is absolutely common. But some of the elements of that teaching have been handed down differently in different hadith within the two communities. And finally, there are events within the life of the community, within the life of the Prophet himself, that have been reported differently and have been interpreted differently. Sometimes it's a question of how do you understand the events that we all agree happened, and sometimes it is that the event has been recorded and reported within one tradition but not within the other. Now, we can think of this happening in lots of different situations around the world. Think of the history of relations between Britain and Ireland, for example. They are reported differently and interpreted differently by both communities. Think of the history of colonialism. The colonized and the colonizer. They tell their history and events very differently. So, common events can be seen and reported and handed down in different ways. We're using the terms Sunni and Shi'a here, but which communities do they refer to on a worldwide basis? Well, the Sunni are between 85 and 90% of Muslims worldwide today, and they are located everywhere. So everywhere in the world where you find Muslims, there you will find the Sunni. The Shi'a, by comparison, are a smaller community, between 10 and 15% of the Muslims in the world. They are majority communities in Iran, Iraq, and in Bahrain. And they are significant minority communities in the Lebanon, in Syria, in the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, in Central Asia, and then in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. Within the Shi'a community, there are various subgroups as well. And that's not a question that we're going to look at today. So when we're talking about the Shi'a today, we're talking about those who follow the line of 12 Imams, the group that we normally call by their Arabic title, Ithna Ashari. One of the things that all Muslims agree upon is that Muhammad is the last prophet. So there is no discussion of another prophet after him. The question that concerns us today is, what happens after Muhammad? Now, let's look at that first of all from a Shi'a perspective. Here we have an understanding of an earlier pattern within the history of prophethood and prophetic communities. So we can look back, for example, to the time of Moses. Moses prayed to God for a co-worker, and he was given the co-worker Aaron or Harun. he was to work with him and to carry on leading the community after the death of Moses. In the same way, Jesus has his inner core of followers or disciples around him under their leader, Simon Peter, who was appointed by Jesus. The term which is used in the Qur'an when speaking of Aaron or Harun is wazir. We're going to translate wazir as minister, the one who represents, the one who has authority in the name of the other. So wazir is a key term in Shi'a understanding. Now, Harun, Aaron, was also a prophet in his own right. And so here is an essential difference. Again, nobody is suggesting that there was another prophet after Muhammad. But the question is, was there a divinely appointed wazir after Muhammad? If we look then into the Sunni tradition, we can see that Muhammad was a single leader within the community. He was the head of the community. That didn't mean that he was a dictator within that community. He exercised the traditional Arabic function of consultation, of shura, of taking wise counsel. And so this gives us then the model within the Sunni understanding of a single head within the community who is working in consultation with others. That's very important because that single head is not totally autonomous. The head, the caliph, the leader of the community, is to lead them according to the Qur'an and the Sunnah. And should it come about that he in some way deviated from the tradition of Qur'an and Sunnah, then it would be for the community to point this out and to correct him. We have hadith of the Prophet here, which give us some idea about who this leader should be, what were the qualities. And the two qualities that are spoken of are those of piety and wisdom. The one who is most pious and wise should be your leader. And so we get a kind of meritocracy so that leadership within the community is open to anyone who is pious and wise. Indeed, we have a hadith attributed to the Prophet, even if he be a black Abyssinian slave, if he be the most pious and wise amongst you, he should be your leader. Thus making clear that this is not confined to a certain social class, a certain ethnicity, or a certain group, a clan or a tribe. Of course, the leader is to be a male. Back in the 7th century, it would be unthinkable that any other suggestion could have been made. But also the leader, the caliph, was to lead the people into battle if it should be necessary, and therefore a male figure. Let's now turn to the question, who decides and how is that decision made? In the Sunni perspective, central to that understanding is that God and the Qur'an are silent. They are silent on who should be the successor to Muhammad. No one is named. They are silent on the job description, if you like, the kind of leadership that should be. And finally, they are silent on the process for getting yourself a new leader. So on all these three questions, God and the Qur'an are silent. Just in the same way, in Sunni understanding, the Prophet is silent on these questions. The Prophet does not nominate, he does not name his successor, nor does he establish a selection process. Now, given that both the Qur'an and the Prophet are silent on this question, it is therefore left to the community to decide this, to come to the correct interpretation, the correct selection process themselves. If we now look at this question within a Shi'a perspective, then we see that we have a different understanding. First of all, God speaks. God speaks in two ways. There is a verse of the Qur'an in chapter 53, verse 3, which says that the Prophet Muhammad does not speak out of his own will, but he speaks through the will of God. Therefore, whatever he says on such a matter is speaking the will of God. Now, this becomes important when we look to an event in the very beginning of the prophetic ministry of Muhammad. After the first revelation, Muhammad told only Khadija, his wife, and his immediate family that he had been called to be a messenger. And he called together a gathering of the family so that he could explain to them his call to prophethood and that to invite them to follow. Now, only one person from within that immediate family took the initiative to step forward and to declare his faith in the prophethood of Muhammad, and that was his cousin Ali. Ali was a youngish boy at the time, perhaps around the age of between 10 to 13. So he declared his belief in the Prophet as the Prophet of God. And Muhammad then answered. And here it's important to remember he speaks not out of his own will, but out of the will of God according to the Qur'an. And he says of Ali that he is to be from this day onwards my brother, my successor, my wazir, and the executor of my will. And so therefore, in Shi'a understanding, this is the Prophet declaring the will of God that Ali should be his successor and his wazir. Now there is an episode in the Qur'an in which this divine appointment, this designation we say, or in Arabic nas, in which this is again made clear by God in an incident in the Qur'an. The setting goes like this. A group of Muslims in Medina are making voluntary prayers in the mosque, and a poor person comes in begging for alms. The only person who responds is Ali. And he is actually in the process of praying at the time, and so he is bending in what we call the position of ruku, bending from the waist. And when he hears the request for alms, he extends his hand, holds it out, and indicates the ring on his finger, that the poor man is to take the ring as an act of charity. Now, this is the context in which another key verse of the Qur'an is revealed, and this is chapter 5, verse 55. The key term which is used in this verse is the term wali. And wali we're going to translate as the guardian with authority. And so this verse speaks of who is the guardian with authority within the Muslim community. First of all, it's God, then it's the Prophet, then it's the one who gives charity while at prayer, bowing down. Now this then is seen to refer to Ali in this act of generosity, and indeed this is then confirmed by the Prophet. This refers to Ali. This is then the divine appointment, the divine designation of Ali. Finally, we're going to turn to an event in the history of the early Muslim community. A few months before the death of the Prophet, he leads the community on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and after the pilgrimage, they are then coming back toward Medina. Now, we know with the benefit of hindsight that the Prophet only has just a few more months to live. And by this time, the whole of the way of Islam has been established. Setting down the principles for the Hajj have been the last of the public religious acts that have been declared. So the whole package is there. It's nearly the end of the Prophet's life. But as they are coming back from Mecca toward Medina, the angel Gabriel comes to Prophet Muhammad. And the verse that is recited here is in chapter 5 of the Qur'an, verse 67. And it says, God speaking through Gabriel to Muhammad, convey to the people that which you were given to convey, without which you have done nothing. Now, what can this be at such a late stage in the history of the revelation of the Quran and the Islamic way of life? The place where this verse is revealed is an oasis, a watering place with a road split to go in different ways, not too far outside Mecca. It's called Ghadir Khum. And some of the community have already gone their own way. So Muhammad calls them back, assembles them all together, and we're told that there are some 72,000 who are assembled here together. And the Prophet then stands on a rock where everybody can see, calls Ali to him, and holds up his hand. He holds the hand of Ali in the air, and he says, all those of you who take me, Muhammad, as your master, your Mawla, you are to take Ali as your Mawla after me. And then we see the way in which the community who were assembled understood and interpreted this. We're told that they pledged their allegiance to Ali. Now there is a verse of the Quran which is in chapter 5, verse 3, and according to Shi'a understanding, this is the occasion when that verse is revealed. And it says, today I have perfected your religion. Therefore, you can see that within the Shi'a paradigm, the Shi'a understanding, we have a clear indication that both God and the Prophet have indicated Ali as the successor to Muhammad. What actually happened then after the death of the Prophet? Well, as you can imagine, there was confusion in the camp because people just couldn't believe that somebody like the Prophet had died. Indeed, there were people who were willing to offer violence to anybody who said such a thing. So there was chaos and confusion. And into this stepped Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr had been a close companion of the Prophet and was respected, and he entered in to where the body of the Prophet was lying. He confirmed that he was dead, and then he came out and announced this within the community. And he told them that their faith must be based on God, not on the Prophet. Now, it was clear to the leaders within the community that they needed very quickly strong leadership, otherwise there would be more chaos. And so they formed a consultation group, a shura. And these would be the senior men, the leaders of the various clans, and they discussed the question together in traditional Arab fashion. And when they had finished their discussion, Abu Bakr had emerged as their choice for leadership. He then was put to the people for their agreement. And again, as one would expect in traditional Arab society, the people went along with the decision of their elders, of their clan chiefs. Why then might Abu Bakr have been thought to be somebody who was appropriate for this task? Well, he was around the same age as Muhammad, therefore he was somebody who had that element of gravitas, of dignity, of wisdom that comes with age. He was a close companion of Muhammad and had been with him right from the very beginning. He's listed as one of the first 4 male Muslims. He also had been the one who migrated with Muhammad, and one of his daughters, Aisha, had become the wife of Muhammad, so he was in a sense related. On one occasion at least, he had been asked to lead the prayers. Indeed, during the latter part of the life of the Prophet, when he was quite ill, Abu Bakr led the prayers in a series of days. And we even have one account of the Prophet joining the prayer behind the leadership of Abu Bakr. Finally, he came from a minor clan, so he was the kind of person who could be supported by all the different tribal groups without it being seen that he belonged to one and not the other. He was to rule the community according to the Qur'an and Sunnah. He was to consult with the people, and for the first 6 months, he earned his own living. After that, he was given a stipend from the communal fund so that it would support him. So he becomes the first Sunni caliph, the first head of the community after Muhammad. During his time in office, a key event was the breaking out, the Ridda, when people broke their contracts of allegiance to the Prophet and to Medina, and they went their own way. And he it was who reunited the Muslim community once again and brought them together under one single leadership. He was a man of valor in battle, of great generosity in his public life. He's noted, for example, for buying slaves to set them free. A man of humility, and a man who also issued standing orders for the way that the army should conduct themselves in battle. We can then ask the question, well, what was Ali doing after the death of the Prophet? Well, remember, he was the closest male relative, he was the executor of the Prophet's will, and therefore his responsibility was to prepare the body for burial and to arrange the funeral. It was during this time that the elders met and they decided on Abu Bakr to head the community. When he heard that, and when the wider members of his clan heard that, they reminded people of the designation of God and of the Prophet that Ali was to succeed. But this did not avail. Those who followed Ali at this time are that embryonic group that we can call now the Shi'a. Shi'a means the party or followers of Ali, those who defended his cause at this time. Now, what was Ali to do? Because if he had pushed the point, it would have led to fighting, it would have led to bloodshed, and he didn't want that the community should be divided by bloodshed at this time. And so he withdrew from the dispute. He didn't give up his claim, but withdrew from the dispute in order to avoid bloodshed within the community. Join me again next week when we're going to carry on this theme, looking at the Sunni and Shi'a interpretations of what happened after the life of Muhammad. I look forward to seeing you then.